Welcome to a Title Plus CPD, brought to you by LawPro.
Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome. I'm Judah Stravchinsky, Director of Practice Pro, which is LawPro's Claims Prevention and Risk Management Program. I'm speaking to you from Toronto. It's also where the offices of LawPro and the Toronto Lawyers Association are located. I respectfully acknowledge that Toronto is on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis peoples. Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. As this meeting is virtual, we're not all gathered in the same space, and for many of you, this land acknowledgement is not for the traditional territory you are on. And in that case, we invite you to visit Native Lands, that's native-lands.ca, to take time to learn about you're on. Native-lands.ca allows you to search by location to find the proper territorial acknowledgement and to provide other resources, including links to friendship centers for further guidance. I'd like to recognize the long history of all First Nations in Ontario and the Métis and Inuit peoples. We thank First Nations who have lived and live in these lands for sharing them with us in peace. So thank you for joining us for this LawPro CPD event, Avoiding the Wire Fraud Nightmare, What You Need to Know to Protect Yourself and Your Clients. This program is presented by LawPro's Title Plus in partnership with Toronto Lawyers Association. So here's how we're going to run the day. We've got an hour and a half, and we've divided it into two areas for discussion. First, we're going to explore 5 different scenarios arising from wire frauds, and these are based on real examples that we see at LawPro. And they're going to give you a sense of the types of attacks we're seeing targeting lawyers, law firms, and your clients, and they're also going to give you a sense of the impact of these fraud attempts, some of which have been successful, of course. Second, we'll present 5 practical tips that you and your colleagues can take and you can start using today to protect yourself and your clients. We've also put together written resources for today's program. We're going to put them in the chat for those of you who are attending live, but they're also available at practicepro.ca/CPD. You can click on today's program event and then click on the click here for supporting material link to download them for yourselves. The speakers we have with us today are incredible. They're amazing experts in their areas. They'll each introduce themselves briefly when they speak, but to learn more about them, their bios are produced in the program materials. So let's start. And like I said, we're going to start with 5 real-life wire fraud nightmare scenarios. We're going to start with the types of issues that we regularly see at LawPro, so that you can understand the true harms of wire fraud. And these events either happen as described, or we've combined elements of multiple cases that we've seen to protect confidentiality or to just demonstrate some of the takeaways for today. And these are some of these real examples have involved our speakers who have helped others in these files, or whose law firms have had to ward off cyber threats. And so we'll discuss the impacts that these have had as well. So to start off, we're going to start with sort of the 1.0 attack that many of you will be familiar with, but that continue to threaten lawyers, law firms across the world, but that also specifically target Ontario lawyers and Ontario law firm staff. And so Tanis, I'd invite you to talk about, that first fake email scam that we have seen and that unfortunately continues to be a threat today. Tanis?
Thanks, Judah. I should start by telling you that I'm incredibly paranoid about wire fraud. I mean, part of the problem is that I like to listen to hacking podcasts. And in some ways, I wish I could go back to that time where I was completely ignorant about all of the different ways that bad actors are trying to get access to my trust account. But that box has been opened. So now I'm just generally really paranoid and suspicious of all emails. And you might be thinking to yourself, this is a program about wire fraud. Well, email is not a secure method of communication. And because of that, it can be used as a vehicle to commit wire fraud. So shortly after I set up my own practice, I had a performance audit from the Law Society. And one of the recommendations that came out of that was putting a warning in my retainers to confirm that sending personal information over email isn't secure, and clients take the risk of doing that when they do. Those warnings still exist in my retainers today. So how does the insecurity of email make us vulnerable? Well, let's talk about phishing with a PH. So phishing refers to an email scam where the intent is to get you to disclose valuable personal information, either through clicking a link and entering credentials or through social engineering. Now, if phishing or social engineering are not terms that you're familiar with, I co-wrote a paper with Phil Brown from the Law Society that we presented last year at the summit, and it's available for free download at Access CLA, or just send me an email and I'm happy to send it to you. So a good example of a more sophisticated phishing scam is an email that looks like it's coming from your bank. So you get a realistic looking email, and it's your bank advising you that, there's a problem, or they're offering something to you, or whatever the scammers think is going to be good enough in order to get you to click and enter those credentials. The website you're going to be directed to isn't a bank website, and once you enter those credentials, the bad actors have them and they can use them to access your own account. And you might say to yourself, I would never fall victim to that. Except the problem is these emails do look legitimate and people are getting fooled. So how do you protect yourself? One of the things that you can do is look at the email address. Is it actually coming from a bank URL, or is it coming from somewhere else? And, keep in mind that you've received multiple emails from your bank. You know what these look like. You probably still have them in your inbox. You could compare. If something seems off, take a look at what you've seen before. And of course, you can always call your bank and ask them. The other thing that you're going to find is that the links contained within the email, if you hover over them, so you're not actually clicking on them, are they directing you to the bank URL, or are they directing you to an entirely different place? And of course, if you do end up clicking that link, I can tell you that because of the sophistication of these frauds, you're going to see a perfect landing page that looks exactly like your bank. The problem is it's not, and once you enter those credentials, then the bad actors have them. So phishing attacks are random, meaning that they're not targeted to you specifically. They go out to a large group of people, and the bad actors are looking to catch the weakest of the bunch who fall victim to that scam. Even with a little bit of due diligence, you can avoid these kinds of scams, but we actually need to be more concerned about targeted attacks, and those are called spear phishing. So spear phishing is when a bad actor has some personal information about you and uses that to tailor the fraud attempt to you. And you might be asking yourself, well, where do they get that information from me? Easy, social media. I've regularly seen people on Facebook or Twitter who post their birthday and their birthday right in their profile information with a totally open account. And if you know the month and date of someone's birthday, you can easily get very, very close to that year. You just source that information from other places online, things like a bio or a resume or LinkedIn. And you can probably get within a couple of years there. And now you've got a date of birth, which is often used as secondary information for verification. Now, this could come at you a couple different ways. You might receive an email from the bank that lists your date of birth along with a lot of other personal information, which is going to make it more likely that you're going to trust that email from the bank. But it also can be used as part of secondary information for password resets. Okay, but it's not just birthdays. Let's say you post something seemingly innocuous on Facebook about your mother's lineage after signing up for Ancestry.com, and you reference something interesting about your mom's side of the family. Now a bad actor has your mother's last name at birth, which is often used as secondary fact verification for password resets as well, but also could be used as information to show that the email is trusted when it shouldn't be. Here's another example from Facebook. If you identify your mom as a relative on your About Me page, then the information is right there front and center, depending on what your privacy controls are. It can be very quick and easy for a bad actor to get that information, even if your profile is locked down. Less than 2 minutes of research and a bad actor can have these details, all of these things that they might need for secondary trust questions. The ease in which this information can be obtained is a great reason why two-factor authentication is going to be a much safer way to deal with passwords. Now, I think somebody else is going to be talking more in depth about 2FA, so I'll leave that there for now. And, it's also important to know that when we're talking about banks have already figured this out. They're not using these, trust questions. But it's not about necessarily those password resets. It's about the emails coming in and whether you trust them. So it's not just about the information someone can get from you. It's also about someone in your network being compromised. So as an example, Ray on the panel today, he sends me an email. I generally trust that it's from Ray because I know what his email is and he sends me emails. If Ray sends me an email and he starts asking me for personal information like my date of birth and my mother's name, this is going to cause a lot of concern and it's going to cause me to pause. First, Ray is never going to ask me that kind of information, but there's a really easy way for me to deal with that, which is to just give him a call and say, hey, did you send me this email? Because it seems a little bit off. And that's really one of the most important takeaways here. If something feels off, you have an opportunity to go and verify it. So we talked about phishing. There's also smishing. That's the same scam, but this one is with text messages. These ones I think are maybe a little bit easier to catch because a text reporting to be from your bank, automatically should seem really suspicious. That being said, I do actually get regular text messages from my credit card company through my bank. So, it is possible that this could be an issue as well. And of course, if you happen to text clients more often, that's not something that I really do, then it becomes more of a concern. So lastly, there's vishing, and that's done through the phone. The base unsophisticated one is the CRA scam where, you have the robot voice asking you for a bunch of Bitcoin. So obviously that one's pretty obvious, or one would hope that that one's obvious. I get a few of those a week, and I'm sure you probably do as well. But that isn't the only kind of vishing scam. The other one is with a live person, again, who has personal information about you. And that's really the component, right? They use that to try and get you to trust that what they're saying is true. So what can we do to protect ourselves? I've got 5 tips here. Generally, be mindful that emails that seem off, like my earlier example, and do further verification anytime something doesn't seem quite right. You will never prejudice yourself by making further inquiries. Take steps to give yourself an online privacy checkup. That's number 2. Ask yourself, what are my privacy controls on Facebook if you use it? Is my profile public? Don't post your birth date on Twitter. Even be careful about posting photos of your home, which could identify your address. Number 3, Ray and other people on this panel today are going to be talking about this, but anyone who asks you to do anything urgently, this is always a red flag when we're talking about email fraud or the breadth of other frauds that can be perpetrated against lawyers. Urgency is the currency of bad actors because they want you to take advantage of those situations where you just don't have the time to do the normal due diligence that you would. This is especially true when we're talking about the delivery of funds. This is why it's a good idea to have a fund policy for your clients. Like with wires, we endeavor to wire within 1 business day of closing of the transaction. And that's a policy that the clients have to agree to from the outset of the retainer. This is not only to account for scheduling issues on our end, but it's also a way for me to rely on that policy if I'm getting pressure to send money urgently when I do have concerns. I think someone else is going to be talking about Denton's and Tricera guarantees, but it is the perfect example of time pressure being the currency of wire fraud. And that case scares me to the very bone because when I read it, I could absolutely see how my office could have been a victim. Number 4, changing payer information. And this is especially at the last minute. This should be setting off huge red flags in your head. So that ties into the urgency currency I was just talking about. And I suspect that it's a bit more vulnerable when we're talking about companies rather than individuals. But this is, again, where stopping and taking the time to ask for advice is really going to be key. And of course, verification. Lastly, let's talk about patching and end-of-life hardware. Those really annoying messages you get on your phone asking you to update the OS? Those are important. And oftentimes they're asking you to update a security flaw that's in the existing software. The same goes for any software that you have on your computer. If you get an alert to update, don't wait, do it immediately. And when your IT person tells you that your computer equipment is too old and you need to upgrade, listen to them. As much as none of us want to be upgrading equipment that works okay already, the issue is software support. Older hardware will stop getting supported And they do that because it's not financially viable, and this means potential security issues. So now I'm going to turn it over to Ray, who's going to tell you some specific terrible, scary stories about wire fraud, although it looks like Judith's got a question for me.
Yeah, so actually, no, thanks, Tanis. That's a great overview. And before we go past this 1.0, where it's a fake email that's looking legit, I just want to caution people. Tanis has highlighted the worst case scenario one where you're giving out banking information or you're giving out wire information to somebody who's actually not who that you think they are. There's a lower form that becomes very popular come holiday season. And because this is that time of year, I want to point out that some people will use phishing and spear phishing to try to get you to send them Christmas and holiday gifts early. And the way it works, and we still see this a few times a year, is somebody will write purporting usually to be your boss. And because lawyers and law firm staff are often online, it's easy to find who a partner is and who an associate is, or who a partner is and who their clerk is. And so they will create a fake address that looks like your boss. And so I get that. My boss is the CEO of LawPro, Dan Pennington. And around this time every year, I get an email from Dan, and air quote Dan says, "Are you busy? I need something urgent." And the thing they need usually is something like, "I want to reward staff this year. I want to make it a surprise. Can you go and order 20 gift cards online of X dollars?" Fine, you go do that. You're doing that on your own credit card because it's urgent. The firm will reimburse you. And the next step is, great, I want to email everyone because we're all working from home and it's so hard to get everything and I'm worried it won't get to them in time. Can you scratch off the codes for each card and send them to me? And you do that, and then you're out whatever the value of those gift cards are. Because Dan was not Dan Pennington at LawPro, it was some other address that I didn't check because I was on my phone and didn't scroll over, or because I was just hurrying and worried about making sure that I pleased my boss. And so those urgencies, the pressure tactics that Tanis mentioned, very important to keep them in mind for this time of year, as well as just more generally. But be alert, and if you see that pressure, be careful. So Ray's going to talk to us about the next level, because we sometimes think, oh, phishing, smishing, ransomware, all this stuff. If I caught that bad email, no problem. But what happens in the case where somebody's already breached and is using emails from inside your firm, or inside your client's area, or inside the other law firm? And we see this. So these are the scary nightmare situations that we call, it's happening from inside the house. You want to think nightmare? Think about that nightmare moment where the person turns to the camera and goes, "It's coming from inside the house." That's what Ray's going to describe now. Ray, over to you.
Thank you for that, and thank you, Tanis, for setting the floor. And let me go up the stairs at this point. She talked about, looking at the email address and seeing if there's a difference. When they're inside the system, when they hacked in and using phishing, smishing, or vishing, they get the information so they can get into the system. They could be into your system. They could be into somebody else in the firm's system. They could be at a client. They could be anybody who's in the thread that you're dealing with with that client. And at that time, then the message comes from their inbox. So there is no difference in the email that you get. It'll be exactly Ray LeClaire at lawpro.ca, and you won't see the difference. Like Tanis said, maybe the content will spark you in that, why is Ray asking for this information? That's not usual. And that's what you have to look at when you get to that level. The next thing to do is to look at it and say, okay, what kind of information am I being asked? Is this normal? Is this regular? Somebody who sends you a joke that typically never sends you funny stories and says, click here. Well, the click here could be to launch a virus onto your system. So again, look for, if you can't find it in looking at the email, and sometimes the change is very subtle. They'll change an I for an L. When you're looking at it quickly, you won't see that. But sometimes if it's the actual email address, look to see if it's something different coming from them. Having said that, they are getting very sophisticated. And what we are seeing now is directions going to lawyers or declines. And we've got a report of a lawyer who regularly acts on commercial transactions, was dealing with a lender that they regularly deal with. They were discharging a mortgage, as they've done many times on behalf of clients. They made the request, as they usually do, to the lender in their usual fashion by email, and got the response, the discharge statement, by email from the lender. The lawyer printed it out, looked at it, and was satisfied that it was valid. The numbers were right. The everything on it, the logo, everything looked good. Gave it to staff and said, "Let's proceed. Let's pay it out." The staff member noticed that this time the lender had changed its method of payment. Instead of being a check that they couriered over to the bank, this time they were asking for a wire payment. She was a little curious, and thank God she was. She called the bank and to the person she usually deals with at the bank and asked about the change in payment method. The clerk indicated that he was quite surprised by that. They had not changed their method of payment, and in fact had not sent them a discharge for that matter. If you look at the document that they got, there was really no way to be able to tell. That's how good it had been modified. In fact, the only part that had been modified is the part about the payment method. So you really have to keep very attentive to this. But not only that, but have staff. I mean, this is a team effort. This is not one person. More eyes does give you more opportunity to be able to discern problems. Another report that we got is a lawyer called the client to have the monies wired for the closing, as they had agreed to that they would do on the day of closing. So they called the client and asked them to wire the funds. Here was the amount and so on. And the client said, "Well, I sent you the money 2 days ago when you sent me the email." The client had received an email from the lawyer's office, purportedly, and it was a document on the firm's letterhead with instructions on where to wire the funds and the amount was about the right amount. Again, these fraudsters now are being much more patient. They hack into the email account and they sit there and monitor and wait for the opportunity. They will monitor the situation, understand what kind of transaction is going on. They have time to download some documents. They may be monitoring more than one account. Once they're into the email, they can watch all kinds of information. So they can get copies of the letterhead. They can get copies of the discharge statements to be able to modify them. And so the client in this case happened to be a couple of $100,000 short for that day. And so one of the things that you have to look at is people say, well, I'm very concerned when people try to redirect the closing funds. Well, in fact, it's not limited to direction. To a redirection. It can be a direction, it can be a redirection, and it can be modifying a document that you expect to get that is not there. And that's why LawPro is launching its Call Before You Click campaign. Judah?
Well, thanks, Ray. A good overview of the truly frightening things we're starting to see, where people are sometimes in law firms' own email systems and waiting and taking the time and picking their moment, and then there are other things that happen along the way. And I wanted to take another example of where a law firm was compromised, just so that we get a sense of how this happens, and so people know that this can happen regardless of practice area and regardless of geography. We've seen incidents involving personal injury boutiques. We've seen incidents involving corporate commercial firms. We've seen incidents in Toronto. We've seen incidents well outside of urban centers. And so this can happen anywhere. As Tanis mentioned, we're looking for that weakest link. And once that weak link can be found, then fraudsters try to exploit it. And so the first example was phishing and smishing and the fake emails. The second example that Ray has generally provided is when the fraudster is inside the house. The third that I'm going to provide now is a corporate commercial fraud from inside the house effort. And what happened in this case is one of the people involved in the transaction lost their privacy on their email. Somebody was able to hack in. And as a result of that, when two small law firms were acting on the purchase and sale of a company, at the last second, an email from one of those actual firms went to the other firm with a wire transfer direction. And it was legitimately sent from that law firm. There was nothing on the face of the document to suggest that this was fraudulent. The only thing to stop this transaction for the purchaser avoiding sending all of the money that was intended to buy a business, so not small change here, to an account that was not, in fact, the lawyer's trust account or the vendor's account for that matter. It was some fraudster's account. The only thing that led to a stop was the law clerk on the other side of this transaction looked at this and thought, that's weird. I know that it's COVID. I know that people are moving to wire, but we've never seen a wire request from this firm to date. I'm going to call across. And that law clerk saved hundreds of thousands of dollars from going missing by simply picking up the phone and calling across, which confirmed that no one had authorized the sending of this email, that people inside the house were unaware that they had been infiltrated, were unaware that this email had been sent across, and confirmed that this was fraud. Pen down, do not click away, do not send monies to that account. And so that was in a rural Ontario setting, small firms, and thankfully it was that personal relationship and knowledge of support staff who know their business and who know that if something doesn't look right, pick up the phone. And so it was a great save. And so not all of these end in massive losses, but it was that one split choice by a well-trained clerk that saved a fraud from happening. So that's just another example that this can happen anywhere. So let's talk now about what happens, the impacts on law firms and their infrastructure if the money does go out, because we do see this. And probably the person who is most into the actual weeds and really the weeds here around all of the ways that people try to obfuscate and make it hard for us to see what's happening is our panelist, Mona Hanna, whose practice is often spent chasing or trying to prevent cybercrime from occurring. So Mona, for our fourth example of the types of things we see in cyber and wire frauds, can you tell us a little bit about what happens to law firms if the money does go out of trust, what you see on the cleanup side?
Absolutely. And thank you, Judah, for that introduction. What I also deal with is having to help with the cleanup. And with respect to wire fraud, as you probably can expect, we get very little time to act in the event you or your firms are the victim of a wire fraud. So typically the threat actors know you're going to realize money is missing at some point. They know they've got to get the money out of the bank so it can't be traced. So in our experience, if you don't catch a wire fraud or a fraudulent wire fraud within the first few hours, it's unlikely you're going to have success at trying to recoup the funds. But if you catch it in time, so let's say you make the wire transfer and immediately you're thinking something's a bit off with that. If you can catch that in time, immediately call your bank. You call them to get them started on trying to recall the funds or trying to cancel the transfer. Now, let the bank get started because sometimes they may be able to stop it in time. Now, obviously, the quicker you act, the better your chances. And as a note of positive, in my experience in my practice, I have seen funds be returned in a handful of cases. It's rare, but again, you really got to be attuned to it and you really got to act fast. Ultimately, though, if you are the victim of wire fraud, you really need to prepare for the worst case scenario that you will not be able to recall the funds. There's methods to potentially freeze the account on the other side where the funds have gone, but even that is extremely difficult. And again, you've got to act quite quickly. But in that case, you've got to start investigating and considering damage control. So the first question we always ask is, well, how did the threat actor divert the conversation about the funds? Was this outside of the house or was it inside of the house? And more often than not, we're seeing that threat actors are gaining access to someone's email account from within the firm in order to monitor the conversation. And of course, the first question you got to be asking is was my account infiltrated? As we've heard from Ray, these threat actors will get into the account. They'll linger for weeks at a time. They'll monitor the conversation. They'll move around emails. They will input mail forwarding rules so that you don't detect a thing for many weeks on end. And they really set it up. They're quite sophisticated. And while they're infiltrating your email account, they may also be infiltrating the email account on the other side of the conversation to ensure that they don't notice anything fishy or anything suspicious happening with the conversation. But ultimately, if you do detect that an infiltration has occurred on your side, you need to make sure your email system is safe and secure. So that's the priority number one if you have figured out that there's been an infiltration. Ultimately, you got to look at what's been happening in your email account. Was it just one email account that was impacted, or did the threat actor move throughout your environment to target different people in your law firm? So were multiple people's email accounts affected? Were mail forwarding rules put in place that you've got to get rid of? Maybe the threat actor put in a mail forwarding rule so that certain conversations were being forwarded out of your own environment. Was spam sent out from your email account? You've got to check your sent folder. Were there further attempts at phishing attempts against your clients or your business partners? Did the threat actor delete any emails? That's common. We see that quite a bit. And when you consider what's in your email account, if certain emails, pertaining to clients or certain instruction emails that were in there, if they go missing, what sort of exposure are you looking at there? And again, are you sure the threat actor is out of the account? So uncovering the answer to these questions obviously takes a significant amount of time. It also takes a considerable amount of resources away from you and your firm. And in many circumstances, you may want to consider bringing in an expert cybersecurity consulting firm to investigate. These are companies that do this work day in and day out. They know threat actor trends. They know the tips and the tricks. And they really can figure out what was happening within your email account. Now, of course, this process can get really expensive, and you may be looking at costs between $15,000 to $30,000 just to get started on the investigation. Now, in addition to all this terrible stuff you need to be concerned about, if you are the victim of a wire fraud, like not even thinking about the money you've lost as a result of the fraudulent wire transfer. There's an additional risk that you may discover through your investigation that the threat actor downloaded an entire copy of the inbox in the process. This downloaded copy of the inbox can be accessed offline, and it can be accessed even when you've kicked the threat actor out of your environment. So even though you think your systems are safe and secure, it's possible that the threat actor has an offline copy of your entire inbox. We're finding it more and more common that inboxes are being downloaded, and that threat actors are snooping through and finding more people to target for fraud. So, you got a handle on situation A, you think you've got control over it. Meanwhile, you've got a threat actor still impersonating you and trying to target other business relationships of yours to further commit financial harm. So it's something you've got to turn your mind to quite quickly. And if you find yourself in a situation where your inbox has been downloaded, there will likely be another layer of your investigation, which is now dealing with a privacy breach. And of course, the notification and reporting obligations that come with it. So pause for a moment and think about all the information that you have in your inbox. It could be thousands and thousands of emails to and from clients with highly sensitive personal information in there. So imagine if all of that got into the hands of a criminal and you can't stop it. So long story short, it's expensive. It can get quite complicated. And if we can avoid it by having multiple sets of eyes on what's happening with transactions, the better. So keep that in mind. I know it's scary. I'm always, accused of being the bearer of bad news, but it is certainly something you want to keep top of mind when you're looking at your email security.
Well, Mona, I don't think anyone can blame you of being the bearer of the bad news. This is just the reality out there. And to the extent anyone's bearing the bad news, it's all of the panelists today, because from phishing through to stuff that's happening inside the house, the fact is that the prevention side is really important. And I'm seeing us light up with questions and comments about what do we do to stop this. We're going to have one more example of what happens when these frauds hit. The impacts on you as an individual and the impacts on your insurance before we turn to the tips. And we are going to have tips, so don't worry, but we want to paint that full picture because it's really important. And we've heard from our own insureds who are duped by fraudsters that it's really important that we share this message, this final message here about the individual impacts that being a fraud victim can have on you as a lawyer or you as a team member. Clicking and then regretting. And so Victoria is going to lead us through this last example to fully give us the picture of the impacts of fraud today.
Thanks, Judah. Hello, Victoria Krunelson. I'm very happy to be here. As an underwriter, I'm always happy to be invited anywhere. I'm VP Underwriting and Customer Service at LawPro, and before I joined LawPro, I was in small firms, mostly acting as a solicitor for about 10 years, so I've seen things from both sides. So the impact of fraud from an industry perspective, wire fraud is a huge deal. Fraudsters are obviously able to lure hundreds of thousands, if not more, out of their victims. And the pandemic has really opened up this field for fraudsters as more of us are using wire and e-transfers for payments, both professionally and personally. There's still reduced face-to-face interaction between parties. And with more staff leaving their organizations, this is only going to get worse. This means there are more opportunities for fraudsters to take advantage of delayed training or uncertainty for your new hires about what's normal for your office. And what happens after a loss? Well, as good as any professionals you may work with are, or as quickly as you act, it's never a great scenario. If your client lost funds because of the fraud, they're hurting and they need someone to make it right. And sometimes you're the one that they're going to be looking at. Did you have a role in what happened to them? Did you have lax security that allowed someone to access your email account? Were you not clear about how they should expect to get instructions for you about fund transfers? Did your staff share details about the client or transaction that allowed fraudsters to easily impersonate you? And what if you were the one targeted by the fraudster? Did you fall for an obvious fraud? Did you receive an unsolicited email to change payment instructions and you didn't have a protocol in place to verify it? Whatever happened, you are now waist deep in something you wanted to avoid at all costs. And it is definitely going to take a toll on you. You might be feeling embarrassed or panicked, anxious, angry, fed up, or simply exhausted. You're worried about your reputation, about your finances, about being able to finish the transaction that you were working on with your client, what's happening to your client, about what it's doing to your staff morale, because they're pretty sure they're going to get fired over this. And you're also worried about all that time that you're spending dealing with this mess instead of on all that other work that's still building up, as Mona said. And navigating through this is very confusing. Who do I call first? Can the banks do anything to help me? Can I still use my computer? Is this going to be covered by my insurance? What's the potential loss I'm going to be responsible for? And like the other panelists have said, the reality is that the funds that are transferred by wire can be picked up really easily by fraudsters, and it's difficult to identify them. The police are unlikely to be able to track them down, and the chances of recovering any of the money aren't good, especially if you delay, like Mona said. The longer you take to act makes the chance of recovering anything just dwindle away. But I'm being a pessimist because maybe it didn't progress to that point. Maybe you prevented the fraud, you had a bad feeling, you stopped communicating with the fraudster, you got some excellent advice, probably from Judah or Ray, and the loss never happened. Or maybe you have clear protocols in place that drastically reduce the likelihood of you being at risk for this type of fraud, like Tanis talked about. Or maybe you took such quick action in notifying the financial institution that they were able to alert the receiving financial institution and freeze the transaction. But if that didn't happen, let's hope you have insurance to respond. And here's where things get even more confusing for you. Insurance covers very specific risks. So you buy E&O coverage for malpractice. You buy commercial general liability for those slip and falls. You buy employment practices liability in case a member of your staff says you treated them unfairly. Maybe the policy you think would cover this type of risk isn't the right policy. Maybe this fraud involved hacking into your system and using your email, or maybe it just involved social engineering to get people to act against their own best interest. Depending on the nature of the crime, who was targeted, how they carried it out, different types of coverages can be expected to respond. So what if you have coverage for the social engineering part, but not for the cyber intrusion? What if the monies were sent out, came from your operating account and not your trust account, so no client suffered a loss? Maybe a third-party coverage, like LawPro's E&O coverage, that reimburses clients if the loss was due to your negligence, but it doesn't cover your first-party losses, your trust account overdraft, your general account, your forensic investigation and credit monitoring accounts. And what if the loss is just so big that it exceeds the coverage limits of whatever insurance you have? With LawPro, unless the claim arose from your error, omission, or negligent act in the performance of professional services as a lawyer, you can tell I say that a lot, then there's no coverage. And if this was caused by a cybercrime, there's only limited coverage for those types of claims. And you still have to pay your deductible and you still have to pay your first party costs. If you haven't assessed your risk beforehand and developed a plan that includes comprehensive insurance, you can find yourself personally liable for losses, whether they're owing to your client, the other side of a transaction, a financial institution, an unpaid supplier, whatever. Insurance for these types of exposures can come with specific conditions, lower sublimits, and high deductibles. And you could be paying for what you think is the Cadillac of insurance, but there's still potential gaps in coverage that might put you at particular risk. That's why it is so important that you're educating yourself on the risks. You're taking a hard look at your current practices, and hopefully, if you haven't already done so, after this session, you're going to be able to make changes in your office, and you're going to go into meetings with the right questions for your insurance advisor and your IT professionals, so your risk of suffering a big loss are hugely reduced. And before I hand things back over to Judah, I just want to remind everybody, when you are impacted by this, if you're impacted by this, remember the Law Society's Member Assistance Program is there to help you out. Completely confidential, doesn't cost you a thing. Your staff can use it as well, but there is help to get you through the initial stages. Okay, Judah.
Thanks so much, Victoria. So, we had an insured who became the victim of one of these sophisticated wire frauds write to me and say, you have to impress on people how devastating a claim is. It's personal, mental health, time away from work, spent with lawyers. It's all hard. And so again, if you're finding that you're in one of these situations, be it a fraud or a regular solicitor's negligence type of claim, there are resources there. And we, in the materials for today, actually have an article where we hope to normalize some of those feelings, because even if you have a close call, it might put the jitters out there. So we've got an article called "Putting the Fire Out" about dealing with the stress of potential malpractice claims. This applies as well to fraud claims, and of course the member assistance program is there for you. So we've gone through sort of the general risks, and let me just summarize them, and then we're going to go to our 5 tips. So first, you should take away from today that the frauds we're seeing that are targeting you are becoming more and more sophisticated. They can involve a fake email or smishing, vishing. They can come from text, they can come from phone, they can come from email. But they can also get really targeted to you, building on your social media platforms or profiles, or just by infiltrating your law firm's email or the email of others who you work with, clients, other lawyers, others, experts, or others who may come into professional contact with you. A wire fraud takes planning, and the damage is done with one click. So it doesn't matter if you trust your client. It doesn't matter if you trust the other side of a transaction. The fraud may be happening to them too. The fraudsters are targeting lawyers and law firms of all sizes. And if you have a bank account, you're a target. So fraudsters are also targeting all practice areas. We've seen attempts against boutiques, solos, smalls from different regions. And the wire instruction may come at the last minute, or there may be a last minute change request, but it may not. It may be that somebody from inside is sending out a wire instruction early on in the transaction. So one click can cause significant disruption, and it can harm your law firm infrastructure and tech. It can harm your relationships and reputation. It can harm your pocketbook, and it can harm your mental health. And so that's why we have today's event, so that we can give you a full 360 view of what's happening out there and what happens if the money goes missing, so that we can focus now on prevention instead to try to avoid all of those harms. So we're going to talk about 5 key practice tips. And the first, as Tanis mentioned at the outset, is around independent verification. And Ray, this is the call before you click campaign. This is the single biggest point that we want everyone, whether you're a lawyer, law clerk, law firm staff, everyone needs to know this one. So Ray, tell us a bit about independent verification. Call before you click is our first tip.
Thank you. So it becomes quite simple. I mean, it's exactly what it sounds like, is that you should call, but who do you call? Sometimes you want to look at the email that you got and call the number that they gave you. That's not the place to go. We have seen, and police have reported to us, they have arrested a fraudster that had 6 phones on him. On the back of each phone was the character that he was. He was the banker, he was the appraiser, he was the client, he was the other, depending on what phone he got, he looked on the back and knew what character he was playing at that time. So be very careful where you get the information from. If it's your client, you already have or should already have that information. And it's very easy to change one number in a phone number. We're not used to even dialing numbers anymore. We click on them to have the phone dial in. So if the number is changed subtly, it can be changed again. So you want to try to find that number independently. So you either have it on file already for a client, you have it on file for another firm, you have it on speed dial if that happens to be the case, but you also may have to go on the website to look for the information. You want to try to get some information so that you're starting from new, not from what is being provided to you. Too often, click here, dial here. Those numbers are part of the fraud, and they're set up so that they can fool you. When you click, when you call, you will get exactly what you expect to get. That person knows the role they're playing. That website will look like what it's supposed to look like, and you will believe that you're in the right place, only to find out, unfortunately, later that you're not. So please take that minute. And it is very easy. Well, maybe not so easy, but if after a long day, a long week, a difficult transaction, working through all of this, you finally get it done. You're happy, you're pleased, the client is happy. You want to send him the money and you decide, oh, let me just send the money now. And you just think, well, I've done this before. And unfortunately, we've had an insured call us. That was exactly the scenario. He had been dealing with this client multiple times, done multiple deals with them. It was normal for them, in fact, to actually direct them to a different account from time to time. That was not unusual. But he had always had the transaction, but it had been a long week. It had been a difficult transaction. They finally closed it. We were talking millions of dollars. And at the end of the day, 5:30 Friday night, he was exhausted. He just thought, okay, I'll just send the money. Client will be happy. Clicked, and he went home. On Monday, the client called to find out where the money was. And on hearing that, he basically called the bank. By Tuesday, they called him back to say, no, money's gone out. And the client confirmed that it was not their account. We're talking, say, millions over that lawyer's insurance coverage. So even if he had, even if the insurance covered it, he was still looking at millions of dollars coming out of his own pocket, a sole practitioner, not something that you want. So as time consuming, and it's not very time consuming, but in that moment, it seemed to be very time consuming. It is not that time consuming to make that one call to save all of that money. And we've given you a few examples today where that made the difference. There's a question on the chat. What if I'm dealing with international client or an international firm and there's a time difference? well, set something up. Have the ability to verify. Do it beforehand. Don't wait till that you're going to be sending the monies out. So in the days or weeks before the closing, arrange to have somehow to confirm what that information is and that it's right. See if there's some way that you can get that confirmation. If you can't talk voice to voice, then you need to find some other way to be able to confirm that so that you're satisfied that you've done something to be able to try to prove that is the case. And one of the individuals on the chat indicated that this is becoming dangerous now to send the information by email. Yes, it is. And it always has been. Unfortunately, fraudsters did not see the opportunities that they had available to them. They now see it, and they are now taking full advantage of it. And so we have to up our game. We just simply have to ensure that we thwart them at their game to try to thwart us.
Thanks, Ray. So, that first step is calling to make sure that you've got, when you get something in writing, that it's correct. And that independent verification goes a long way. We are going to talk about some of the ways that we can more securely communicate. But first, our next tip, which Mona and Tanis are going to lead us through, is training, because everyone needs to be on the same page here. And you're only as strong as your weakest player. So this one's a real team sport. And Mona and Tanis, tell us, how do you run things? What are you looking for? How do you make sure everyone's rowing together?
Thanks, Judah. Well, I'll get started by, you heard from the outset that I like podcasts, so I try to listen to a lot of podcasts that scare me daily. But you don't have to put that kind of effort into it, particularly if you don't like podcasts. You can do something as simple as subscribe to Avoid a Claim. Those are the emails that come from LawPro in the middle of the night that will tell you about the different kinds of scams that they're seeing. There's also a lot of informal groups on practice areas for real estate. In my area, there's a Facebook group of over 1,000 people, and people are talking about scams there, so it's helping. There's also a WhatsApp group, and I'm sure there are other informal groups in different practice areas. Of course, it's not just you. It's all of this education isn't useful if your staff aren't a part of that conversation as well and taught to be really vigilant. So for those of you in the office, or for that person in the office who's maybe a little bit tech resistant, these are the people that you should be considering spending more time with, because you're only going to be as strong as your weakest link. And being paranoid is a really good thing. And case in point, and this isn't so much about fraud, or at least it wasn't when we started setting it out, it was more about making a mistake. We always have 3 sets of eyes on a wire before it goes out. And you only need one wire to be delayed before you will do everything in your power to ensure that you've done everything you can to make sure that there aren't going to be issues. But the great thing about being paranoid about being right is that it also creates checks and balances for anything that might seem amiss. So I'm going to turn this over to Mona now for some more tips on that.
Thank you, Tanis. Your recommendations are spot on, and it's all got to come together to stop wire fraud. So we always look at, who is in the last position to stop a wire fraud. And if you have 3 eyes on money leaving your account, you're going to be in a much stronger position to stop any sort of fraud that's going to happen. So I'm going to give you my top 3 suggestions on the issue of training staff and whatnot. There was a question in the chat about how threat actors are getting into email accounts. Phishing emails are by far the top attack vector and the easiest way for threat actors to access your email system. So my hot tip, think about conducting email phishing campaigns within your firm. So test your staff with fake phishing attempts and see if they fall for it. Are they clicking malicious links? Are they downloading attachments without considering the sender? Are they reviewing the email sender to make sure the email address is correct? There's services out there that can run these phishing campaigns. They're fairly inexpensive, but it's certainly something you'll want to consider. If you do find that staff have fallen for it, like Tanis said, you'll maybe want to spend a little bit more time with them to make sure they're aware of certain errors that can be missed. On that note, my second tip is have an open door policy with respect to errors. So create an environment with your staff where they feel comfortable telling you when something bad has happened. As I mentioned before, the faster you act with a suspected wire fraud, the better chances you have to retrieve the funds. So if you create an environment where people will feel safe to tell you that they've made an error, you will be in a better position to stop further damage from occurring and potentially recoup the funds. And finally, train your staff not to treat their email inboxes like a data storage facility. So encourage them to delete as many emails as they can that contain sensitive personal information, and ensure all that information is stored in your secure document management system. So in the event you find yourself in a situation where a threat actor has downloaded the contents of your entire inbox, you will be in a much better position from a privacy perspective if there is minimal to no sensitive information contained in it. So keep that in mind. The more we can get out of our email accounts, the better. So those are my 3 tips for staff training.
Thanks, Mona. In addition to the staff training, we need to keep our tech up to date. And so this is the third basket of where we're gonna chat further, and really there's lots in the chat in the live program about this. So there's lots to be done here. The bottom line is, just like it's December, winter tires are coming on. There's risk if you don't keep things moving, keep things updated. You got to maintain your systems, right? And so pick your analogy: gardening, driving. We always have to stay on top of things, and tech is no different. So Mona, what are a few tips to get us started around maintaining our tech to make sure that we're secure?
Well, a good starting point is have a password policy in place. Make sure you and your staff are practicing good password hygiene. So force password resets, every 6 months or every 8 months on some regular interval. Don't make it too regular because, A, people are going to forget their passwords, and B, your staff might think it's normal to get a password reset every couple of months, which may also be a way that they may be targeted for a phishing campaign. If they get a fake email saying it's time to change your password, and they do because they expect it every couple of months, that could be another way into your system. Make sure your antivirus software is up to date. Make sure your operating systems are up to date, like Tanis mentioned. Usually operating systems release an update because there's some sort of security patch that's been implemented. Another big tip is if you can, and I would recommend, you have 2-factor authentication to access your email accounts and to access your database where you store your personal information belonging to clients. More often than not, what we're finding is that is the most effective way to prevent infiltrations into your email systems. And what we're finding as well is the privacy commissioners, when you do experience a privacy breach, are asking about 2-factor authentication. So we're seeing it becoming more and more of the norm. And I suspect in the next 5 years, it's going to be required, not just from insurance companies, from the cyber insurer perspective, but, possibly from our regulators. Another thing you'll want to consider is setting up a cloud-based secure website to transfer documents containing sensitive personal information, or even sending these documents with password protection or encryption. This will, of course, avoid the risk of potentially having these documents sitting in your inbox, and it'll mitigate any sort of potential harm if you do experience a breach of your email account. Now, there was a discussion in the chat about sending wire transfer details via email and whether or not that was, too dangerous to be doing. I think the reality is we rely on email communication quite a bit, especially now in a post-pandemic world where a lot of us are working remotely. And the best way to handle it is, consider encrypting your PDF documents. It's very easy. You open your PDF, and under tools, there's the option to protect the document with encryption. So perhaps consider this when you're giving clients and other law firms details of your bank account information for the purposes of transferring funds. So we can't deny that we're using email, but we can make it safer. And on that note, make sure you are instructing your staff to send this type of information in a PDF, and certainly not in a Word document. We find Word documents are easily altered, and they can be manipulated. And if a threat actor gains hold of a Word document, they can easily change the banking information with your logo on it, and it'll be believable. So yes, keep tech up to date, and make sure your staff are using the proper the proper avenues for sending personal information and sensitive data.
So Mona, let's talk about this a bit further, because there are a lot of people here who are solos or smalls or true solos. True solos in the sense that they have no other staff. So there's one question that's come in about the rule of three, 3 pairs of eyes. And my suggestion is, if you are a true solo and you've got this wire transfer coming in, maybe you can't have others look at it, but you can pause. And you can review that document a second time and then pause again and look at it a third time. So at a minimum, you can replicate that sort of that off pressure policy where you're not just going to click away, right? You're going to spend the time to make sure everything is looking correct to reduce risk. And so you're going to train yourself to slow down when it comes to handling of money. The second question that's come up from the true solos is, what are we supposed to do about tech? Is this going to be so cost prohibitive compared to big firms? And the truth is, and I want to be super clear about this, we're in a blessed time for technology, where in fact, true solos can operate super secure, super high tech with minimal cost compared to just years ago. There are full suite solutions available, be it Microsoft, Google, or other. But take Microsoft for an example. You can pay on a software as a service basis. So you're paying monthly, and you will know what that monthly amount is, and you're not stuck with a crazy upfront cost. And you can have your email, and it can be protected. And Microsoft's backend security and junk filters and spam filters are going to be helping you to fight phishing as you go. You're going to have a backend where you can use cloud-based systems for document storage that are relatively secure. You can prompt for Microsoft to make sure that you have to have 2-factor verification before you log in. And so what that means is, simply put, I'm going to try to go online and start emailing, and before I'm allowed to log in after giving my password, they're going to send a text to my cell phone to make sure it's me. And increasingly, the banks are requiring this. If you want to do personal banking, Gmail just announced that they're going to require 2-factor authentication for you to just use Gmail. So these sorts of key security features are becoming the default, are becoming the norm, and are not overly expensive. Mona's also right that there is training to get used to how to lock a PDF or how to encrypt an email. But these are not actually costly things to do in today's environment. These are just things that we need to learn how to do, and then they become second nature. Mona, am I missing anything about this?
No, you got it all. You got it all nice and concise for everybody. And I think at the end of the day, some people can have the best tech out there, but it really depends on how much you're paying attention to these small details. So it's got to come hand in hand. The tech with the human error, the tech and the human attention have to play a role together.
I would say also, there's been a lot of movement in the practice management type of communities about the need for client portals, because emails going back and forth, there are all of those risks that Mona mentioned. And there are simple solutions like SharePoint, where you can invite your client. And there are other industries that are doing this de rigueur. And so, if you have a site where your client can check on documents or can upload documents, or where you can send them secure things through a client portal, and it can even sometimes be branded to your firm. And so true solos can actually amplify their ability to serve clients through using technology. Some clients may be a bit hesitant about some of this, depending on where they are on the tech curve, but some are expecting it now. And increasingly, they're going to expect it on a go forward. And so there are lots of different ways to explore portals. You can check everything from what Microsoft offers to what practice management softwares offers, their built-in solutions. But there are ways to reduce the email risks by putting it into a safer online environment for you and your client. So now that we've talked a bit about some of the proactive pieces to have you set, another proactive piece to help you sleep better at night is to think about your insurance, to make sure you're covered. And so, Victoria, why don't we turn to the insurance needs now?
Okay, well, let me just start by saying a good plan to prevent loss is way better than a great plan for how to respond when the loss occurs. When you're applying for your insurance, you're going to be rated on your plans. And if you haven't already started to take steps to better protect yourself, you're going to run the risk of not being able to get appropriate insurance, or at least not at an affordable price. So you already know about LawPro Insurance, which provides that third-party coverage for claims arising from mistakes when you're acting as a lawyer. But that isn't really a crime or a cyber policy, and that's what we're talking about today. This isn't going to help you with all of those first-party losses that are associated with frauds and attacks like credit monitoring, public relation costs, notification expenses, fines and penalties, data recovery, business interruption. I could go on. But you might already have crime coverage or cyber coverage in place as a standalone policy or as an endorsement under your CGL, your commercial general liability. But you're really going to want to double check that, because there have been a lot of coverage disputes in this area because insurers sometimes deny coverage for wire frauds because there's no direct fraud. If the bad player doesn't actually attack your system, if they're invited in by a duped employee or they simply mislead someone into sending the money to the wrong place, some insurers have taken the position that the fraudulent transaction was given consent by the insured or trusted employees. As well, if the employee who carried out the wire transfer wasn't technically the one authorized to do it, that might also mean you don't have coverage. And some traditional policies in this area are going to have an express exclusion relating to cyber-related incidents. So if the social engineering fraud can be characterized as a cyber-related crime, you might be out of luck if you haven't bought a separate policy for that. As someone who has a lot of experience applying for these types of policies, I know just how hard they are to fill out and read the policies, and I'm saying that as an underwriter. The coverage can change year over year. The losses, especially for cyber, have been really high. They're running at like a 400% loss ratio right now, so the premiums are going through the roof. For every dollar they get in premium, the cyber insurers are paying $4 out in claims right now. And it can be a nightmare if you discover you've been spending a lot of money on insurance that doesn't provide you with coverage you need. Not all cyber policies are going to include social engineering. And if they do, they may have a sublimit that really doesn't meet your needs. That's why I think it's essential that you have an advisor, I'm going to say an insurance broker, that can help you navigate this. Maybe your existing CGL already has some coverage for social engineering. Maybe this is an optional coverage you could have added on midterm or at renewal. Your advisor can look at the various coverages you have in place, including your LawPro coverage, and see where there are potential gaps and where you're already well covered. Things that I would keep an eye out for: be careful of the conditions and exclusions. Think about the scenario where you thought you were paying an invoice to a supplier, but you were tricked into paying a bad actor. Some crime policies have a condition that your supplier has to have their own insurance if yours is to respond. So the fact that your supplier may or may not have their own crime coverage shouldn't stop you from being able to put in a claim. And you're going to want broad, all-risk language in the coverage. Remember that when you're talking with your advisor. If it says the loss has to directly arise from the use of an email, that is too specific. We've already heard about phishing and mishing and all these other types. If they're contacting you through Facebook or LinkedIn, or if they contact you by writing you a letter, old school, you want that to be covered just the same as if it was sent to you by email. If your client gets imitated, it could just be as easy for it to be your supplier who's imitated, or an executive with your firm who supposedly sent instructions to the bookkeeper. So you're going to want to ensure that the coverage includes vendor supplier imitation, as well as executive imitation and client imitation. And you're going to want to think about what you're actually paying for. You want to see what is the deductible, what's the sublimit, and what assistance is provided after an event. How quickly can you get help with recovery efforts or to replenish your trust account before closing is supposed to take place? Last year, most small businesses in Canada bought cyber coverage. They chose $1 million per occurrence, and it had a median cost of around $1,700. About 37% of those businesses actually paid more than $2,000. And what you pay is going to depend on the type of business you have and how attractive it is to fraudsters. I hate to break it to you, but law firms are more attractive to fraudsters. And as I said, this renewal, I'm seeing the prices go up more than 100%. So it's not going to be cheap. I'm letting you know that now. Depending on the insurer and coverage you go with, Some are going to have pre-breach services you can take advantage of, like penetration testing, assistance with drafting policies for your staff, employee privacy awareness training. That would be great if you can get these all included because they are invaluable. I'm going to highly recommend that you put in the work ahead of time to make yourself the most attractive client an underwriter could possibly want. By thinking like an insurance company and preparing yourself accordingly, it's going to help you get through the application process, which will reduce your premiums. It's going to lower your risk of something bad happening. And generally, this is going to help you sleep better at night. Like I said, the applications are long and technical, but do your best. Mona already talked about IT consultants that can help you fill in the details. If you don't have the internal support necessary to do that, you might get a sales pitch when you go with these outside companies. Be prepared for it. There are going to be questions in the applications that aren't a simple yes or no, despite what the application says. So you might need to explain something in more detail. So just append an explanation. Don't try to sugarcoat the truth. You know you've got a duty of utmost good faith in insurance applications. And be prepared to say, we're not perfect, but we're working on improving X, Y, and Z, and should have this completed within so many weeks or months, if you believe you can deliver on that. The underwriters really want to understand you and your exposures, your risk of loss, your compliance. So be prepared to answer questions about how big is your firm? How is cybersecurity managed? How are employees trained? How important is cybersecurity and privacy to management? Don't underestimate that. What are the biggest predicted losses and how is data identified, classified, and stored? The underwriters are going to ask you supplemental questions, especially these days. Don't be spooked by this. This year, with people working remotely and the rise of ransomware, the focus has definitely shifted towards multi-factor authentication. What measures do you have in place for training your staff? How secure are your backups? Do you ever test your systems? What controls do you have in place to review the approval process for wire transfers? And finally, when you're thinking like an underwriter for cyber crime coverage, you're going to be ready to say that you have all of these things already in place. Privacy awareness education and training for all employees. A business continuity plan that's tested at least annually. Email protection systems to detect phishing attempts and block them. Endpoint protection systems, malware protection, and host-based firewall and intrusion detection systems. Some kind of access management, such as multi-factor authentication, persisters that can be accessed remotely, and for systems that handle highly sensitive information. You're going to have documented policies in place that are actually followed that address data protection and loss prevention, employee training. I know I've said it before, but it's just that important. An awareness of what is on your network. How much sensitive personal information do I hold, including medical and financial information for my clients, and what vulnerabilities are associated with this. And you're going to say the word encryption in your application. And you're going to say the word encryption a lot, especially these days. The underwriters really want to know that you only allow encrypted connections to your firm system. This goes back to the people asking about the importance of VPN. This is where VPN is super important. So now you can see why underwriters aren't asked to speak all that often. We have so much to say about insurance.
So Victoria, thank you. Look, this isn't meant to scare anyone. It's meant to show that if you work on the prevention side, it becomes easier to get coverage to help you be fully protected and fully prepared in case something does go wrong. And let's just highlight a few points about this. First is Victoria's outlined a whole bunch of steps. And again, a lot of these are not particularly expensive to implement, whether you are a true solo or a large firm. Penetration testing is something that firms can offer to you and that you can subscribe to, and that can keep you on your toes, be part of your training. You don't need to reinvent the wheel. You don't need to make a fake email address and start trying to spam your clerks and see if you can get them in a gotcha. There are companies that will test your systems for you. VPN is extremely inexpensive and is pretty much de rigueur now. So if you're not on VPN already for remote work, you need to be. I mean, that's just where we're at. There have been a lot of questions about, whether LawPro offers this or should offer this. The bottom line is that we are mandated currently to provide the errors and omissions insurance for lawyers. We don't and never have offered all of the insurance that a law firm might want. And so it's really up to lawyers and law firm managers to assess their risks and figure out what else do we have. If you have a physical office, You might need a policy that covers slip and falls and the risk of a flood or the risk of a fire. If you own your building, as some law firms do, you need to really think about what kind of property insurance you may need. If you are renting, you may need to check your lease because it may require you to have certain insurance. And so part of running a small business, or for some of you, maybe a larger business, is to really think about the entire scan of available insurance options. And there are brokers who can help you with this. And so we're there to cover one slice, but we want to make sure that your entire business is protected, or at least you are aware of your risks and aware of the options available, which is why we had Victoria on to talk about some of the things from that back-end experience so that you can be as prepared as possible when you go into those discussions. So with that, we're going to talk about what happens if things do go wrong. And, we still do see this from time to time. So in the materials, you have tips. You have all sorts of tip sheets. They're all printable. They're all short. You can pin them on your cork boards. There are in the index, you can actually link straight to the original of the article if you just want to print one page off at a time. Ray's got an article in there about what happens if things go wrong. So Ray, why don't you give us a couple of minutes here about, if you realize that you've clicked and now you're worried, what to do next?
Thank you. And that's exactly what the article talks about is you've now discovered that there's been a misdirection and the money's gone to somebody that wasn't supposed to go. So what do? Time is of essence here and you need to act quickly. The first thing you do is call your bank, the sending bank, and ask them to recall the wire. As Mona has talked about, that you will be told that they cannot do that. That's how wires work. They go out, they don't come back. Then ask your bank if they haven't sent it out. And sometimes banks are slow in sending the wire out. You put the information in, it's there, it's out of your account, but it's not been sent. So there's a chance that it's still there. If it's not, have that bank call the receiving bank. Ask them to freeze the funds or to recall the bank, the wire. Again, be told they can't recall. Ask that bank then to call the next bank. Fraudsters have typically set up a leapfrog system for money. And so what happens is there's instructions already waiting there. Once the money hits the account, it's to be wired out to another account. If you're lucky, it's one account. If not, they split it up into various accounts. But at least that's the system there. So you need to try to get the bank to convince them to go down the chain to the bank that has it. If you're lucky, and it has happened to us and at least one insured, the monies were there. They were frozen. The bank had their anti-money laundering system had caught it, and they were wondering what to do with it. And when they got the call, of course, then they froze it. That was great. The money's there, but it's not in your account. How do you get it back? That's a different story completely. You need to get court orders and so on, but let's not deal with that. So you've asked the bank to recall the wire. You've asked them to forward on to try to freeze the funds going down. What do you do next? You report the matter to your local police as a fraud. Any insurance that you have will require that you have a police report, so might as well get that started. You will file a claim with LawPro with supporting documentation. Will that be covered? It depends. It goes to Victoria. Sometimes she's in a good mood, sometimes she's not, but it'll depend on the facts. And so you need to send us your documentation and we may be able to assist if we in that situation. You also want to consider filing with your other insurers. Victoria talked about all of various types of insurance you may have, cybercrime insurance, office insurance. There may be possible recovery there. So you want to get everybody in the call as soon as possible to get them to understand it. You want to obtain an IT forensic audit if it appears that your system has been hacked. You want to understand how they got in, what they're doing, are they still there? And you want to stop that. And then you want to find out, well, what Mona talked about, the other impacts of, did they only get in to direct the money, or did they download the information and now you have a bigger problem? So you'll want to get that audit done. You'll also want to alert the client or the third party that were involved in that thread, that there has been a diversion, fraud, and requests that they consider whether their systems have been compromised and they need a IT forensic audit. You want to act quickly. You want to act cooperatively with every other person that's involved, the insurers, the client, the other parties. You want to be in that place, and you want to act as quickly as possible. And finally, you want to pray. This is an unsettling position to be in. And when all that was required to avoid it is to call before you click. Prevention is always best. Thank you.
Thanks, Ray. Well, we're coming up against almost 11 o'clock. So let's just review the 5 areas where we've got the tips. So first, as Ray said, we have to get into the habit of calling to confirm wire instructions that we've received by email or otherwise in writing. We have to call before we click. That independent verification step is something that you need to be comfortable with. And if you're in a team environment, then you need to train your staff and your clients and engage in ongoing learning. If you're a true solo, it's on you, but you can just continue to learn about these risks and be proactive to make sure that you are ready to face them. You need to keep your tech up to date. That's our 3rd tip. And we've talked about antivirus software, 2-factor authentication, password hygiene, and using portals to the extent that that might be of interest. The 4th tip is to think about your insurance needs. And if you think that there are gaps in coverage where it could fall to you if something goes wrong, fall to you personally, fall to your firm, and that makes you uncomfortable, we recommend starting the path of getting your firm in shape, if you're not already, to address these risks, to make sure that you are prepared, and then apply through a broker to see what sort of coverages may be available. And of course, if things do go wrong, you need to call LawPro immediately. We'll help you, and there will likely be others that get involved as well. So that really comes to the end of our program. We have had so many questions from the audience. We've done our best to answer as many of them as we can. And we really thank you for this wonderful engagement through the live session. Just a few housekeeping matters. The program's eligible for 1.5 hours of professionalism. So that's the Law Society of Ontario CPD requirements. It's also eligible for LawPro's risk management credit. That can be claimed by going online to lawpro.ca. The program will be available for replay at practicepro.ca CPD webpage. And for those of you here now live, it's in the chat function where you can find that. When the replay is available, we'll send out a post via our blog, avoidaclaim.com. If you want to be in the know as to when this comes live, you can subscribe at avoidaclaim.com for our updates, and you'll get that information straight to your inbox. You'll also get regular updates with practice management tips and fraud prevention. We have so many thank yous for today. Thank you to the new Title Plus for presenting today's event, and to the staff at Toronto Lawyers Association and LawPro who are working behind the scenes to make today's event run smoothly. Thank you all. Thanks to Ontario's law associations who promoted this event, and to all who joined from across the province and beyond. Thank you to our speakers for sharing their time and expertise with us today. And we have one more request from you. Thank you for coming. You'll be receiving an email from the Toronto Lawyers Association for the program evaluation. We ask that you please complete it. It's going to help both the Toronto Lawyers Association and us at LawPro develop timely and helpful programming. And if you have other specific comments you'd like to share, or just want to reach out with me, you can feel free to email practicepro@lawpro.ca. This concludes our program. We thank you again for being with us today. Take care, and thanks for joining us. All the best.